Australian schools have been slipping in terms of providing the basic knowledge that a 15-year-old who's tested should have or could have.
I'm Trisha Jha. I'm a research fellow in the education program here at the Centre for Independent Studies, and I'm joined by Alan Hanushek, who is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University in California. Thank you for joining us, Eric.
It's nice to be invited.
Well, we're very, very lucky to have you. Today we're going to be talking about a question that I find really interesting because I'm a teacher by training. I've also worked previously in education policy. And one thing that I've noticed is that economics as a discipline has made a tremendous contribution to education research, but that's more been over like the past couple of decades. Whereas I know that that's something that it's something that, although we kind of take it for granted these days, that maybe wasn't always the case. So I just wanted to start off, first of all, because you are so well known for your contributions in this, I guess, that space between economics and education. But first of all, let's start with economics. So what kind of first got you interested in economics?
When I was doing my graduate work at MIT, there was a major U.S. study that came out called the Coleman report. And it was really the first quantitative study of education in the country. It was sponsored by the U.S. government and was 750 pages worth of statistical analysis. You couldn't go 3 pages without a page of statistics. And nobody understood it. Nobody had any idea what it was saying. And two Harvard professors, Daniel Patrick Moynihan and Fred Mosteller, organized a faculty seminar to try to understand what this document said. I snuck into the back. I had a friend on the Harvard faculty who snuck me into the back of the room. And I was interested in it because the common interpretation was that schools just didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was parents and maybe the peers in the schools, but the schools themselves didn't make any difference. This struck me as crazy.
Yeah.
We're paying 6% of our national income to support education, and if it doesn't matter, why are we spending so much on it?
Yeah,
and why
absolutely.
do people want to keep spending more? So I got intrigued with the whole topic. I ended up writing a thesis on it, and then kept finding new and more interesting questions along the way. There weren't any economists when I started, and then more and more saw that there might be something interesting there and started joining in.
Yeah, so that kind of is a really nice pivot into my next question, which is about, I guess, that transition in the economics profession, in the economics field, towards like caring about education. So kind of give me a little bit of a history. Like when did that sort of pivot like really start in earnest? Like when did you kind of start to be joined by colleagues and things like that? And what do you think drove that level of interest? Was there a particular field of research? Was there some study that kind of started it off? Like tell me about that.
Well, I think that the motivation for a lot of the early work came from the Coleman report that tried to relate student outcomes to what factors determined those outcomes. Many people couldn't believe the answer of the Coleman report. And in fact, the Coleman report in a scientific way wasn't very good by current standards.
Despite being 750 pages long and covered in
Despite being
statistics,
750 pages long. But at the same time, it pointed people in a very different direction when they thought about schools and education. So I and a few other economists started working on these problems, and more economists became interested in it, particularly when they disagreed with the results that people were getting. Could these results be right? And so more and more people tried to give their own analyses. more and more data started becoming available so that more and more people found this was a subject that was amenable to the tools that economists had, and it was clearly big policy. It had a big difference. It made a big difference for how people decided on education policy.
Yeah, I think that's that idea of it being I guess, a field or a way of channeling economics into something of great public importance. So this idea that, as you said, like, we spend a tremendous amount of energy and money into this field, so we kind of really need to make sure that it's being underpinned by, stuff that's based on evidence and what we actually can see from the data. So obviously that's been like in one sense like your life's work. So, and I realize we could kind of go on about this for ages, but what do you kind of see as like the sort of the main contributions that you think you've made in this field, and what are some of the main things that you found looking at this intersection between economics and education?
Sure. Well, I think one of the early things that I found was evidence of how important teacher effectiveness was and how important teachers were in producing student achievement. Very early on, I did a study of a small school district in Southern California that had data on achievement of students and linked it to their teachers. And I spent a couple afternoons driving out to this school and opening up their student records and recording what achievement students had relative to their backgrounds. This is entirely illegal today by privacy reasons, but at that time there was no sanctions against it, or nobody saw any problem with that. And early on, I found that teachers were really important. This led to other questions about, well, what is it about teachers and what is it about schools that makes them so important? And I slipped into study of backgrounds of teachers and their characteristics. And lo and behold, after spending some time looking at all the evidence available, found that we didn't do a very good job at describing which teachers were good and which weren't, or which were effective. And not, I shouldn't use the word good or bad, but which teachers were effective at increasing student learning and which teachers weren't. And that itself became controversial because everybody wanted to believe that if we just increase salaries for teachers, we'll get better teachers, and then student achievement will grow. But that wasn't what was happening, and it hasn't been what we found since then. And I guess the biggest controversy in my own work was that I early on argued that reducing class size was not a good investment. There was a great movement to try to have smaller and smaller classes. That was going to be the answer. And I looked at all the evidence, including some I generated myself, and found that there wasn't strong evidence to suggest that lowering class size by 1 or 2 or 3 students was particularly valuable for learning, but we knew it was really expensive. And so the economist came in and said, well, maybe it's not just whether we get any impact of reducing classes, but we ought to relate that to what's being spent on doing that.
Yeah, you kind of really need to relate, I guess, that the cost at the margin of, say, I don't know, even like of you reducing those class sizes relative to, well, how many extra teachers would you have to hire? How much was that going to cost? What about the quality of the additional teachers that are coming into the system? And it's interesting that you say that these things are controversial, or that they were that when you were kind of doing this part of the work, because in some sense they still are controversial. This idea that, oh, if we just pay teachers more, then we'll get more. Like we still have that discussion. I think the class size one is probably one where, like, you've won a little bit more. Like I think people would definitely recognize that, yes, that marginal gain from reducing class sizes by a little bit maybe isn't the smartest investment, that you could potentially put that funding into something else, for example, like developing professionally your existing teacher workforce, or perhaps other mechanisms. So I find that really interesting that, and it's funny because I find a lot of people in my profession as a teacher will sometimes be a little bit skeptical of researchers and economists and number people, like bean counters and that sort of thing. Yet it's actually your work that has actually really shown the power of teachers and how so much rests on their capacity to be effective. So in my view, I see your work and the impact that that's had, and I think that this is some incredibly important work because it actually shows how important teachers can be. But I want to kind of come to the other side of that. So you've kind of looked at what makes teachers effective in terms of generating student outcomes. But what about student outcomes and achievement? Now, the other side of the work that you've done is really about that relationship between educational achievement, which is to say demonstrated skills, and economic growth. But demonstrated skills, as you've said, is not the same thing as educational attainment or spending a certain number of years at school. Can you explain a little bit about what those two things are, how they're different?
No, I'm happy to talk about this. There's a measurement issue that has been driving through the whole education policy discussion of the last 50 years, and that is, how do you decide which schools are doing well and which aren't? Historically, we didn't have any data about what kids were actually learning or what they knew at any point in time. All we knew was how many years of schooling they'd had, how much attainment they had. And economists spent a lot of time, they were happy with that. They thought of looking at the investments that people made in terms of the time they spent in school and relating that to performance and so forth. It turns out that that was a very bad measure because schools differ and kids differ in what they've learned and teachers differ in what they've taught kids. And so many people have exactly the same amount of schooling, years of schooling, but have very different skills and learning that they've picked up over time. Employers and nations should be focused more on what kids have actually learned. It turns out that this is not the same. It's not the same across individual schools or even individual classrooms because of teacher differences. And it matters because we now know pretty well, where we have lots more measurement of the achievement and the knowledge of students. We now know that people who know more earn more. The labor market rewards people that have more skills rather than less, even if they have the same years of schooling. That holds for nations too. So one of the other things that I've done over time is try to show that nations that have a more skilled population, let's measure it just by the standard achievement test we have, nations that have more skilled population grow faster. And it's economic growth that really means that you are better off than your parents and that your children will be better off than you because the overall well-being of the country is lifted with economic growth, productivity enhancements that make more outcomes, more products, more cars for the amount of money we put in comes from productivity improvements, and productivity improvements are closely related to the overall skills of countries.
That's fascinating. And it kind of leads into the next question that I have, which is, I guess, about I guess, 21st century economies. Now, we could talk about this idea of like, the knowledge economy, like Australia, the United States, a lot of, post-industrialization nations are now built on knowledge. And so there is an assumption that if we want knowledge, we need to be, if we want more knowledge, we want more skilled workers, we need to be investing more in things like higher education. But of course, as you've just kind of said, that attainment is not necessarily related to actual skills. So can we talk a little bit more about what is actually a knowledge economy, and what is, I guess, the relationship between, delving a little bit deeper between a knowledge economy and, I guess, the skills of its people. So I guess human capital is what I'm really wanting to know about.
Human capital is the term that economists use to apply to all of this. It's not completely defined, but what we know is that people who have more basic skills find it's possible to learn the next level of information, so that people don't start becoming electrical engineers with no knowledge beforehand.
Yeah.
They build up to that. And we know when we look across universities that a big part of the quality of the university graduate is what skills they came into the university with.
Yeah.
So universities add something, but the process of education is cumulative. And this whole idea of the knowledge economy and 21st century skills is now sort of the buzzword. And it's sort of, people should be able to think deeply about subjects and reason and intuit lots of things. That has been applied in schools in ways that I think has not been very helpful. What we've seen is people saying, well, we don't want to just teach basic skills to people. We want to teach them 21st century skills. You can get the basic skills by Googling something.
Oh, yes,
and so
just Google
forth.
it.
And now we can get it by ChatGPT, get all of the prior stuff. So we just have to start at the high level, as if everybody is going to derive Newton's calculus on their own. And it turns out that having the basic skills enables you to then move on to more advanced skills. And the electrical engineer who has stronger skills in grade 4 or grade 8 probably does better as an electrical engineer graduating from the engineering school in the country. And so these things build on each other, and it's important to get the strong foundation and not to ignore that.
I think that's really interesting, and it's what you're saying as well is really backed up by cognitive scientists and people who really research that relationship. And it's interesting because in the Australian curriculum we have this. It's called a general capability, so it's across all curriculum areas called critical and creative thinking, and it's something that students are supposed to be developing all the time across the curriculum. And in one sense, sure, like you would be expecting a certain level of attainment in, say, or a certain level of achievement in history to link to critical and creative thinking in that subject. But I think you're right in the sense that schools have really taken the wrong message from that, and they think, well, in order to get them to think creatively and critically, we need to teach them how to be creative and how to be critical, and ignoring the fact that creativity is really domain specific, and critical thinking is incredibly domain specific as well. I mean, and then the importance of actual knowledge is something that I feel is really, really underrated, not just by school systems and schools in terms of where, and this has been my experience in a couple of the contexts I've worked with, of the teacher actually needing to know their subject. But also it's not something that I think is encouraged in, initial teacher education. That idea of subject matter expertise, like the idea that a teacher needs to be an expert in the subject that they teach before they go and then try and teach it to students, is something completely lacking as well. But I think it all fundamentally comes back to the same issue, which is this assumption around all this fad, I guess, around 21st century learning or modern knowledge economies. Like, they don't really need people to know it because you can Google it. And I've got to tell you, the times where I've asked students to Google something in a class as part of a lesson, that would just really disabuse me of the notion that kids can learn things by Googling.
Sure, they still have to make decisions, and they have to know enough to decide which of the Google return entries make sense and which don't, or where they should go. I mean, the worst of this, I think, is some of the math instruction that says, well, it's not really important that you get the right answer. We just have to look at how you thought about the problem, and if you did this creatively, then it doesn't matter that you got the right answer. And in some sense, we don't want our rocket scientists not getting the right answer.
Yeah, I mean, the next time when you're back at home in San Francisco, if you're driving across the Golden Gate Bridge, you probably want the civil engineers who built that to know
the right answer.
The right answer.
Yeah, that's precisely the issue. And the right answer, knowing earlier bits of knowledge, allow you to think creatively. It allows you to think, well, where does the current knowledge stop, and what can we add to that? That's what creativity is. It's not reinventing a bunch of basic things. It's allowing you to move the knowledge frontier, and you have to know where the frontier is before you know how to move it.
Yeah, and that always reminds me of some of, as I've seen images of Picasso's, obviously, famous, innovative, highly creative artist. But if you look at some of his earlier sketches and things like that, very much done in a traditional style. So it really suggests that even in those highly, highly creative fields, he had to develop and, I guess, hone a talent and a skill in order to then be able to, I guess, break the mold and to take painting in a completely new direction. And I think that that's something that applies to pretty much every discipline, especially the ones that we would expect students to kind of come out of school and be well equipped to deal with.
Absolutely. And that's, the Australian economy, or schools like the U.S. economy, U.S. schools, the Australian schools and the U.S. schools both suffer from not giving as strong a basic skill background as other schooling systems in the world. And we've seen that the international test, the PISA test that I think many people in Australia know, indicate that the Australian schools have been slipping in terms of providing the basic knowledge that a 15-year-old who's tested should have or could have.
I just want to go to our sort of a last question, and this is a little bit of a fun one. Talking about, we've obviously done so much about the intersection of economics and education. So let's just say a teacher and an economist go out on a date. What do they talk about?
Probably about the most recent football score. But can they talk about the discipline? Sure. One of the, going back to our prior discussion, I always think of myself as a big supporter of teachers and teaching. But the reason why some in the teaching profession don't is that I've suggested there's a big variation among teachers, and some are better than others. And when you get down to it, particularly people who are trying to make policy toward teaching, they don't want to admit to the fact that some are better than others, and sort of recognizing that they slip back to, well, we all spend the same amount of time in the classroom, so that's what should count. And we're all taking it seriously, so that's what more do you want to know? So I guess teachers and I can talk about variations in effectiveness, but every time I do that, there is no teacher that I've ever talked to who doesn't say, well, you know, I do know that Mrs. Jones isn't quite up to it, and she's not doing a very good job. And will readily admit that, which is just what the evidence says.
But then I guess it's that making that extra step. Well, do you feel that maybe there should be a difference between how Mrs. Jones and yourself is paid? I think that that's the one that maybe breaks teachers out in a bit of a sweat.
Sure, that's where they start sweating, and then they start saying, oh, well, all of this is political, and so you wouldn't want to have leaders in schools making decisions because it's all political. They would only support their favorites. And it turns out that's not the case. When given an opportunity, principals are very good at evaluating teachers, at least at the extremes of the distribution. And I think everybody who's ever walks into a school, from the principal to the teachers to the parents to the kids to the janitors, knows who are the really good teachers and who are the really ineffective teachers, with confusion in the middle and so forth. But we never want to use that information when we make schooling decisions, and that's costly.
And that's a really fantastic note to end on, because as we're sort of considering, you know, there's always big issues in Australian education about funding and how we should use funding. What do we need to do to get better teachers? We're talking about teacher shortages, maths and science teachers, teachers in rural areas. All of these issues, I think, fundamentally come down to this issue of, well, these things have a cost. What are you willing to pay? And what are you willing to forego in order to have some of these things? So thank you so much for joining us. It was a
Thanks for
lovely
having me.
conversation.
Yeah, it's a lovely discussion.
Thank you.